Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today, this afternoon. This is the third session of the day of the 2021 Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. This year's summit is being held during International Compost Awareness Week, the largest and most comprehensive education initiative in the compost industry. I'm Natasha Duarte, Director of the Composting Association of Vermont. I'd like to start by giving a huge thank you to all of our sponsors this year. These include Community Bank, Eco Products, Vermont Natural Ag Products, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, AgriLab Technologies, Inc., EcoPixel, Nature Cycle, the Vermont Produce Program from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and the Eco-AmeriCorps program from the Department of Environmental Conservation. I'd like to invite Toby Alves from Eco Products to join us now as our featured sponsor for this session. And he's going to tell you just a little bit about their work. Toby, do you want to share your camera?
Sure. My camera should be on. I've got I live in northern.
There you are.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I was going to say, okay. And I live in northern Maine, so I suffer the same technological difficulties that you might have similar things in Vermont. Thanks for the introduction, Natasha. My name is Toby Alves. I am a product and zero waste specialist with Eco Products, headquartered in Boulder, and we provide compostable products as well as post-consumer recycled products to the food service industry. We refer to ourselves as your partner in grime. We believe waste can be a wonderful thing. A bottle can be recycled into a blue striped cup. An unfinished meal to go can nourish our soils. A takeout container with food scraps can be sent to the compost. It sounds hard, but it's our job to figure it out. We obsess over things like composting, recycling, and a product's life cycle. We put specialists in the field to work with local communities to expand access to commercial composting and recycling. We seek out opportunities in our everyday operations to curtail environmental impacts. We believe there's purpose in our plates. There's consciousness in our cups. There's potential in your humble food scraps. You don't need to be an expert to understand. Together, we can turn the end of a meal into a planet of possibilities. At Eco Products, we put waste to work. If folks have any questions on compostable food serviceware and how they function within the composting infrastructure, you can reach out to me at any time or anybody at our home office in Boulder. We do our best to work with composters and to work with operators to see how we can divert the maximum amount of organics from the waste stream as possible, get them to compost in an efficient manner. And real good to be here with all you folks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Toby, and thank you as well for Eco Products' continued support of the summit. Before we get into today's program, I just have two short announcements. One is about a new initiative for the Composting Association of Vermont, Changing Lives Through Compost, One Scrap at a Time, a multi-generational statewide art challenge. This stemmed from my friendship and work with Paul and Winsong Kervik to create a 2021 food scrap story calendar featuring photos that they took of their food scrap bin throughout the year. And then after the calendars went out, a 4-year-old Neoma saw the calendar on her grandmother's wall and wanted to make her own food scrap art. And they shared that back with us. And so we were really motivated by all of this creativity, and we reached out and have a lot of partners on this project as well. And so this week we're launching the statewide Food Scrap Art Challenge as an outreach and education activity for Vermont. Submissions will be featured on the CAV website, and some will be selected for our 2022 calendar. So if you'd like to be a partner, if you'd like to learn more, you can find that on our CAV website under projects or at compostingvermont.org/foodscrapart. And now on to today's program. I'm going to introduce John Fay, who will be facilitating this session. John Fay is the programs manager for the Wyndham Solid Waste Management District, implementing outreach and special waste programming in Southeast Vermont. Since receiving his MS in resource management and administration from Antioch, New England in the late 90s, He's worked as a solid waste consultant for DSM Environmental Services, Inc., assistant director for the Greater Upper Valley Solid Waste District, a middle school science and math teacher, an analyst for the Vermont DEC Solid Waste Program, and also a permit specialist with the Vermont DEC. John's experience includes running commercial scale composting operations and assisting commercial and institutional facilities with optimizing their waste and management systems. With that, John, I'll pass it on to you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's session on multifamily or multi-unit housing and how to manage food scraps at them. Multi-unit housing complexes have unique challenges in being able to divert food scraps and sustain those programs. Many have offsite managers. Often the food scraps composting is communal with little oversight. Space for bins is often cramped, and outreach has hurdles to overcome. And many of these complexes are renter heavy, so that there's a lot of turnover. And of course, as anywhere, there's issues with vectors and critters such as bears, raccoons, squirrels, and things like that. So it's a difficult situation, and we hope to shed some light on that during this session this afternoon. We have a fantastic panel for you today that will provide several different perspectives on how to manage food scraps at multi-unit housing. First up, we're going to have Emma Stuhl, who is from the Materials Management section at the Vermont DEC. And she'll be providing a background on state regulations and resources available from the state of Vermont. Next, we'll have Cassandra Hemingway from the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District. And Cassandra has done a lot of work in Central Vermont on encouraging multi-unit houses to find ways to get their food scraps going. In Washington County, Orange County, probably some other counties too. And then we have Russell Amanzadi from the Burlington area, who is a resident and a board member on a local multi-unit housing complex. And it's called Ledgewood South. And he kind of spearheaded getting the food scraps diversion program going at his home complex. So he has some on the ground advice from there. And if there is time at the end, I have some information about our programs down here in Brattleboro, Vermont. We have curbside collection of organics in the town of Brattleboro, and a few multi-unit complexes have found successful ways to do the program. So with that, I say let's get right into it, and I will pass it on to Emma.
Thank you, John. So I am going to just give that high level overview of the landscape here in Vermont, and I'm going to focus on multi-unit and rentals because that'll give folks who are multi-unit, not rental folks information, and also give folks who are in single unit rentals some information. So you can go next slide, John. Nice. Okay, so I know a lot of people here know this, but in case we have some folks from out of state or new to the state, food scraps are banned from the trash here in Vermont. It's part of the Universal Recycling Law, which was passed unanimously in 2012 because there are so many good reasons to get food scraps out of the trash. And this law has rolled out over time gradually, and starting last summer, food scraps became banned from the trash for everyone in Vermont, no matter where they are, including at our homes. So it really brought this multi-unit residence setting to the forefront. Next slide. And in conjunction with this requirement coming into place last summer, the Vermont Department of Health's Rental Housing Health Code activated some requirements for the owners or property managers or landlords related to food scraps, and I'm just going to touch on them briefly. You can get more detail during the Q&A or by reading the code itself on Department of Health's website, or we have a user-friendly fact sheet and frequently asked questions on our website, which is vtrecycles.com. So the code activated these food scrap requirements for landlords, and that includes that the owners need to keep common areas free from trash, recyclables, and food scraps. And they need to ensure that the trash, recycling, and food scrap containers and systems do not attract pests or create a public health hazard. Next slide. And the code gets more specific for that second one and says, to make this happen, to not attract pests or create a public health hazard, you need to provide and maintain durable, watertight receptacles for any food scraps that are going to be stored or managed outside. So that means that if food scraps are going to be managed on site, and there's not already a durable and watertight system and container for those food scraps, that is the owner or property manager's responsibility to provide a good container, whether that is a backyard compost bin like this picture on the bottom, or a solar digester like this picture on the top left, which is actually dug into the soil. If a company is picking up the food scraps from the residents, they often provide a container. But again, that responsibility is on the owner to make sure that that container is sufficient to be fulfilling their obligation. So you can see in this picture on the top right that this property manager added a bungee cord to this container that their hauler provided. And that is a really great, simple, low-cost way to make sure that raccoons and squirrels can't get into the food scrap cart. Next slide. And then the code also now requires landlords to assure arrangements are made for the removal of food scraps at least once a week. Clearly not in the trash because they can't go there. And this is done in 3 primary ways. One is to hire a company to pick up the food scraps, hire a hauler. The second one is to manage those food scraps on site. And the third common option is to bring food scraps to a drop-off. And I'm going to go into these in a little bit more detail in just a minute or two. But first, I just wanted to say that if you are wondering what your options are in your local area, next slide, please. You are in a town that is part of a solid waste management entity, and the solid waste management entities where Cassandra and John work, for example, are really the local experts who know what options are in your area. So you can always contact us. We're happy to help you figure out what you need to know, but I definitely encourage you to go to 802recycles.com, put in your town, and it'll bring you straight to their website, and you can get this local info of what options exist in your area. Next slide. And before I go into a little more detail on those different options, I also want to just highlight this question that people ask sometimes where they say, well, if it's a rental and it's multi-unit, or if it's owned and it's multi-unit, should we have each individual residence have their own system and plan for their food scraps, or should we do something shared? And in my experience, and will be great to hear Cassandra and Russell's experiences, in my experience, if there's a number of units, if it's a medium or large setting, it can often be more cost-effective, time and space efficient to do something shared. Just like you would have one trash dumpster instead of having every household necessarily putting out their own trash cart. But there are cases, in some condo associations where everybody does put out their own trash cart, or there could be situations where there's only 2 units and it makes sense for whatever reason to have each unit have its own plan and have the landlord, assured that the arrangements are made for each of those units. Okay, next slide. Thanks, John. So let's go into a little bit more detail. So in many parts of Vermont, but not all, there are companies that will pick up small quantities of food scraps. They provide a bucket and they pick that up. That's a great size for 1 unit. If there's not many people in each unit and they don't produce a lot of food scraps, that could be shared in some circumstances. That can vary widely, household to household. But in a lot of multi-unit settings, instead, folks hire a company that provides a cart, like this picture on the right, that the residents dump their food scraps into, and then that cart gets picked up. So you can already see how it could be more cost and space efficient to have a lot of residents dumping into one cart rather than having all these different buckets in some settings. And those services exist throughout the state. Next slide. Managing food scraps on site is an option also, especially if it's a relatively smaller quantity of food scraps. And we'll hear more about this a little bit later. And managing on site can be a good option if you have the space for it. If you, if you have the space for it, and if you have people, either one person or a number of people who are committed to putting in the time to make the system work well. And the more food scraps you have, the more commitment you are likely to need for that system to work well. So for example, I've composted for 2 people in this black bin on the right, and it was really low maintenance. I just put in my food scraps, covered it up with leaves, stirred it occasionally. I never even had to empty the bin. But I've also composted for multiple units for 6 people in one of these bins, and it worked well. And I needed to empty it out sometimes, especially in the fall, so that there's space for the scraps to freeze in the winter. You know, and that's like shimmying up the bin, moving it over, shoveling the pile, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so you need just some of that time commitment. There's larger systems like this picture on the left that maybe Cassandra might touch on or be able to answer questions about. Next slide, John. And then there's also these solar digesters that I mentioned earlier, which are more work to set up. Initially, they need to be dug in and they might need to be moved every few years, but then they're less month-to-month commitment. It's my understanding. I don't have one, but because you just need to dump your food scraps in, you don't need to also add those browns and stir the pile. And I think this is just a good example of somebody who said, we want to do this method, we think it'll be a good fit, but we think we need more than one. And so for our system to be successful, we need to size it for the amount of food scraps we're going to have. Next slide. And then last but not least is the drop-off method. And I've seen this done a number of different ways. So I know of one situation where there was actually a property manager on staff who put out buckets that the residents dumped their food scraps in. And that property manager put the buckets in the truck and drove them to the transfer station that accepted the food scraps. And that was what that community decided was most cost effective and would work for them. And I should just say there's drop-offs at transfer stations, fast trashes, bag drops, many compost facilities, and also some farms. And this is a place where asking your local experts can help you figure out what your options are in your area. So that's one way I've seen this. Also, I could imagine, again, if you only have a couple units and you're near a very convenient, not cost prohibitive feeling drop off, that if you have residents that have a car and that are happy to drive, I could imagine a situation where the residents would say, sure, we'll bring our food scraps to the drop off, or, oh, we're already doing that. And then the landlord would have assured that those arrangements are made and they could fulfill their obligation that way. But if you have residents that don't drive or that don't have a car, or you don't have a drop off that's convenient near you, then that's not going to be an option. So that's part of why it's so good. There's lots of different options because different things make sense for different settings. And then the third way that I've seen this happening, oh, sorry, go back one more. The third way, thanks, that I've seen this happening is we've seen some property managers set up their own drop-offs. So property managers that have multiple buildings that are near each other, we've seen some of them, instead of having a bin at every building, instead having a bin that's within a block or two of every building and setting up their own system. And apparently with great success. So similar to that first example with the car, you can imagine there could be residents who aren't able to walk their food scraps 2 blocks to the bin. So that would again be a place where the landlord would have that responsibility to help connect the dots. And maybe they could find out if there's a neighbor who's happy to bring their food scraps, bring the first neighbor's food scraps when they go with theirs. And there are a lot of people in Vermont that are enthusiastic about composting and happy to do little favors to make it happen. So I do encourage people to ask there. So now let's go to the next slide. And for these programs to be a success, when there are so many potential challenges that John listed at the beginning, there's some sort of base strategies that can be really helpful. So we're gonna look at these two pictures and just sort of work through what are some of the things that these folks are doing in these pictures that could help make their programs start well and then be successful going forward. So one thing you notice in the picture on the left is that they're covering up the food scraps with some dry brown plant material. So whether that's in a pickup or whether that's like a pickup company or whether that's a backyard compost bin, covering those food scraps caps in any smell and just makes a cleaner experience for everyone and for the next person. So that's really helpful, especially if you're in bear country and you don't want your smells wandering out into the world. Another thing you may have noticed in that left picture is that that bin is pretty clean. If you look at the lid, if you look at the top, it's really clean. So another thing to think about is who's going to clean the bin. There are some haulers who provide clean carts every time they come pick up the material. There's a couple parts of Vermont where the hauler will let you use a certain brand of liner, compostable liner bag, but that's not an option in many places. And then there are also haulers that provide this cover material, like you see in the picture on the right. The hauler actually provided that container that has the cover material to spread it out. So if you're getting different quotes, that's something to ask about. What service is provided in those spaces? And if you go with a hauler that isn't providing that cover material, you can still ask them what you can use as cover material, and that's something a landlord could provide. In this picture on the left, you can also see, I don't actually know if this picture was taken inside, but it was very close to a building for sure, and maybe even in a bay, in a garage bay. If you are in bear country and you've got this clean, nice system, you have the option of storing your bin in a shed or garage, then that is a really great and easy strategy. You don't need to then think about all the other strategies you can use to make sure your food scraps are not attracting bears. And I don't know if folks have experienced this, but once you get the food scraps out of the trash, that can help with the trash being less fragrant also, which can also help prevent animal issues. So let's move to the picture on the right. We already talked about the cover material. Oh, sorry, go back one more. One thing this picture is doing really great is that this drop-off is doing really well.
I just want to interrupt to say you've got about 5 more minutes.
Oh, thanks, John.
Sorry.
They have a really detailed sign, what goes in, what doesn't go in. It's green, the official Vermont color for food scraps, and it says food scraps only. So really the education and the information is key for having a program be successful, especially if there's a lot of units and it's not as much like neighbor chatting with neighbor able to transmit information. And next slide, John. So some haulers provide, or a lot of haulers provide this information, but if you want more signs, more images, we have lots of them at vtrecycles.com that you can either hand out to residents if there's a new program starting, or that you can use to label your bins like we saw in that other picture. And next slide, John, thanks. We also encourage folks to use the statewide food scrap symbol and color, and all these things are available to print on our website. Use them widely, and if you don't have access to a color printer but live somewhere that could benefit from these, you can be in touch and we'll get you what you need as we're able. Next slide. So I'm just gonna, oh, and I did want to say, actually, one of the drop-off we saw, one of the things that property manager said made their program so successful is that when they launched it, they did do some purposeful education of their residents at the beginning to say, this is our new program and here's how it works, here's what goes in, here's what doesn't go in. here's all the info, here's how to get questions. And they've had a lot of success with some tweaks along the way. Okay, I'm just gonna wrap up by touching on composting in bear country. If you'll click, please. If you are in bear country, it's not related to composting, but one of the most important things to do is to take down your bird feeders unless there's a foot of snow on the ground. Unless you're in deep hibernation season, bears love birdseed. They can smell it from far away. It draws them into neighborhoods where they might look for other things to eat or come across other things that have interesting odors. And if you're in bear country and you haven't checked out Vermont Fish and Wildlife's Living with Black Bears website, I definitely encourage that because it has other like pretty simple best practices to do, like always feeding pets indoors, storing birdseed inside and not just in a bucket under the porch, that sort of thing. So if you've done all those and you're going to compost on site, it's important to use that durable container that's got latches or would be hard for a bear to open. And we've been told that those tumbler turners, the rolling barrel turners, are pretty bear resistant, or very bear resistant. And I also know folks who've successfully used these on the ground types as well. It's important to line any openings with that wire mesh hardware cloth so that voles or other critters can't tunnel in. But it's also very important, if you'll click, John, to do what we already talked about earlier in these backyard compost bins, which is cover up any smells with 3 times as much of the dry brown plant material. And that just, helps make your compost bin smell like a leaf pile and not a pile of food scraps. Go next slide, John. There are a bunch of other really simple, easy to implement strategies to prevent bear problems before they happen. If you're interested in that info for backyard composting, check out The Dirt on Compost, a guide to backyard composting that's courtesy of Cassandra, who's up next. The last 2 pages are just exactly that, strategies to prevent animal issues. If you're getting food scraps picked up, then in a tote, or you have garbage carts, also a lot of these tips are really helpful too. Check out this handout that we made with Fish and Wildlife that can help you just be strategic about your tote. And if you do have a problem, it has advice for putting up an electric fence or other strategies. And you can always be in touch with our agency, either Fish and Wildlife or us at DEC, for one-on-one strategizing and talking through what to do if you are having an issue, or if you're concerned that you might have an issue and you want to make sure you're really setting up just right. Thank you so much, everybody. And look forward to hearing the stories from other folks.
Great. Thank you, Emma. All right. Well, having no questions at this time, then we can move right on to Cassandra. Cassandra Hemingway from the Central Vermont Solid Waste District.
Hi, thanks, John. I just want to acknowledge there's a lot of words on my intro slide. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge the USDA Rural Utility Service, which has provided a grant that the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District is currently implementing. And that's how a lot of the programming I'm about to tell you about is made possible with that funding. So Emma gave a really good overview of all of the options available. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we've been hearing about from tenants and landlords, and what we've started doing over the past few years to work with property managers and landlords and try to address some of those challenges. So we started really realizing we had to have specific programming for landlords a few years ago when we continually got phone calls from tenants who wanted to recycle or wanted to compost, and it just wasn't available. Their landlords weren't providing it despite the law. So that was one thing. And then simultaneously, we were offering community compost sites, and we set up the Barre Housing Authority with a couple of sites at their properties. And we were able, through that program, to tour some of their properties, including this one in the image here. By touring their facilities, we were able to acknowledge and see firsthand what they're dealing with. This site here is an 11-story property from the Barre Housing Authority. They have 3 multi-story buildings, And they manage trash through trash chute that goes straight down the building in the middle. And the buildings were built that way. So not only are they challenged by everything else we've been hearing about, like, you know, what, you know, are tenants going to do it? Are property managers or landlords prepared for the cost or the extra staff time involved? Do they have a location that works for on-site, or do they need hauling? All of that. But they also have this challenge of their actual building is built around an entirely different way of doing things. We also recognized that most of the property managers we were meeting with didn't have resources to provide things like the equipment, the pails, the bins. That was an added expense, and they didn't feel that they could, their tenants could absorb an increase in the rent to cover their overhead for that. And lastly, they clearly needed support with signage and training, and that's really come a long way in the last few years. So next slide, please. So the first thing we did was we realized we really weren't sure how to approach this huge array of issues. So we just held a panel discussion, a lot like this one. We had, actually we brainstormed with Emma, who just presented, and we had somebody from DEC come and give an overview of Act 148, the Universal Recycling Law. We had Carolyn from Grow Compost talk about how food scrap hauling works at the larger sites and really get into the granular details about that. We had a manager of the Downstreet Community Housing, where we held the event, talk about their experience. And they weren't all good experiences, so it was real. It wasn't a whitewashed discussion. And then we actually had this gentleman here talk about how to properly manage sharps, which was an issue that was pretty relevant to most of the property managers there. We recognized immediately from, afterward, we had just a sort of conversation. We realized that we had a gap with the larger, like, housing authority and the community housing sites that were really like nonprofits or big organizations geared around affordable housing. They had some resources one way or the other, whereas some of the smaller landlords who were maybe managing 2, 3, 4, 6, 10 unit properties had a totally different situation to deal with. And so we were really confounded a little bit about how do we approach all of these sizes and challenges that folks have. So we came up with our own programming that would start to address it. And in the first year, we were able to find our money in our own budget to start providing some pails for tenants, just because we had learned by doing backyard compost training that people, if they can hold that bucket in their hand, they get ready for a change. It's something about having something tangible. So, and then we also applied for and received the USDA grant funding, and through that created the programming I'm going to talk about in a second. Next slide. So, and also out of that, that initial panel discussion, we created a landlord page on our website where we just wanted to have like a clearinghouse of information where if we did hear a complaint from a tenant, which happens, I'd say every week or every other week, we get some kind of email or phone call. So if we do get one of those complaints, the minimum we can do is send them to our landlord page. And it's great information for tenants because they do want to know what the landlord's responsibility is. And it's a great place for landlords to get all the resources they need. It includes a link to the Vermont Rental Housing Code. There's signage that they can download right from the website, and all the details about food scraps recycling and the special recycling items they come across too, like TVs, computers, the kinds of things. We just saw one of the sites where we're setting up food scraps. The dumpster had a pile of computers on the ground next to it, which is, we're going to get those cleaned up right away. But those kinds of things happen. So we're approaching it from all the solid waste management issues. Next slide. So we were able to get that in our budget for FY19, and those pails went pretty quickly. And then we wrote that grant, and in the grant, we decided we were going to focus just on one city in our district, Berry City. And the reason is because Berry City is one of our 19 member towns for the district. It's the one that has the highest number of people living below the poverty line and the highest number of rental units and affordable housing all in one place. So we knew that there would be a big array of types of housing situations, and we'd really be able to use this funding as a place where we would learn how to provide programming and assistance to the landlords and property managers, and ultimately to the residents. So the grant allowed us to purchase 1,200 pails and 517 recycling bins. And that number is just odd because we bought as many as our budget line item would allow. And we also were able to buy 75 soil savers and 25 green cones and all the peripherals you want with that, the hardware cloth for lining them, the browns and the storage for browns, and even fencing, and also to pay for training and reimburse for our staff time. Next slide. So we were doing what I call the spaghetti on the wall approach. Does anybody remember that saying, you know, that where you would throw the spaghetti on the wall when you were cooking, and if it stuck to the wall, it was done? I don't know, maybe that might date me a little bit. Well, this is the concept, is that, okay, there is such a huge gamut of what people's needs are and what can work. I mean, you might have the perfect site for backyard composting, but your landlord is just not going to do it. Or it might be the perfect site, but the tenants aren't going to do it, or, you know, on and on and on. So we just wanted to provide options that we could facilitate, and we had this grant funding to set people up and get them over that initial hump of getting started, for the gamut from what would work for a duplex to what would work for one of those 11-story buildings. So we set up an intake form or application. That's that link down at the bottom there, where we started reaching out to through Front Porch Forum and emails, and we actually held another panel discussion online and started getting interest in. So if a property manager or landlord wants to join the program, they go to our intake form, and then they can check, these options are set up like a checklist, and they can check what they need. And then that starts a conversation. After we talk to them, we may well find they don't actually need everything they check. We've had a bunch of people just check everything because, and they don't necessarily need that, but we have a place where we can start talking. And it also, in our intake form, we ask them, you know, how many properties are you managing? How many units? And we get a little information, so, you know, we know who we're serving. Next slide, please. Also through the grant, and when I say through the grant, I just mean the grant reimbursed us for the staff time involved in writing this waste management guide for landlords. It was based on the information that we had already set up on our website, but this is an 8-page guide. We're able to work with a designer. We don't have the design skills on staff for something that nice looking. But the guide is something we can just hand people or hand tenants. And it really goes through all of the materials they need to be managing, what their requirements are, and all of the resources they would need if they want more information. Next slide. So the other thing is that we have encountered challenges. And, you know, one of the challenges is we're doing all this stuff, but we're learning at every turn. At every turn, we're learning something new. We're still, like figuring out, oh, I wish we had, a year ago planned things differently. We're getting things done, but, one of the challenges was in the beginning, we weren't getting as much interest as we thought we would. We had all these things to give away and we announced it, and then it was like crickets for a little while. And so, we use those webinars that are like similar presentations to the one you're seeing today. We use those to get people, so we could tell them about the program, and then we'd get a couple people apply. And the Front Porch Forum post, we'd post on Front Porch Forum in Berry City, and we get a couple more applications. Then we got really lucky, and Berry City created a landlord registry that we just got access to last month. And I know it's new because I had reached out to them a year ago, plus 3 years ago, asking for something like that. And they just coincidentally, created it in time for us to use it So that's kind of amplified our outreach, and we're expecting to, right now we're working with almost 20 property managers, and I think we'll be, able to really increase that in the next, we have 6 more months of the grant project. So if I were going to go back in time and plan this from the beginning, I would have, we did try to find that, but I would check with the municipality you're working in and find out if they have a landlord registry. And the other thing I would have done if I could go back in time is look at their zoning ordinances. I thought I had, but when I looked at them more closely, we were alerted just about 6 weeks ago that we may need to, the property owners who were putting in on-site composting may in fact need to have a permit for that. And we looked through the Berry City zoning around trash composting and recycling, and it was very unfriendly to on-site composting. And it turns out they just had so many resident complaints because people were doing it badly and creating smells and attracting animals that they created zoning laws that made it really difficult to, if you were going to work with the city, set up composting. Everyone was anyway, but so we had to reach out to their planning director and have a conversation about our program. There was a little disconnect in the city because we had actually had a letter of support from the city, but we just, crossed wires around this ordinance. But once they found out what we were doing and we had an upfront conversation, we found out that, we got the green light to go ahead, but we do need to provide enclosures. So even if it's a soil saver and a green cone in a duplex, we've got to make sure the property owner knows they need some kind of fencing around that. That was sort of like the minimum that we have to do to meet that zoning law. The other challenge we had is we still are needing more properties to work with. We have a lot of materials that we haven't yet distributed. Next slide, please. So this is sort of our count as of last week. It doesn't look impressive, and it does at the same time. We've handed out over 260 compost pails. And so some of those are for like duplexes and 6-unit places. Some of them are for like 50 pails to a Berry Housing Authority site. And we have another 1,000 or so, 950 or so left to hand out. 61 recycling bins. The green cones and soil savers, we started distributing those this spring, and that's when we realized we needed to back up and work with the city around the zoning piece. And then, so we're just like this week, actually, we have this backlog of property managers waiting who are getting soil savers and green cones. And just to back up a little bit, when we distribute a soil saver and a green cone, we don't just give it to them and go away. If you can see in the picture here, this is a duplex. They got 2 soil savers, but we also give them everything they're going to need to keep it as animal, deterrent as possible. So there's a roll of hardware cloth that you can't see, and they've had a training and instructions on, lining underneath the soil saver with the hardware cloth. We give them the container, and in this case, it's a galvanized steel trash can, and browns to get them started. And they also get a handout that just shows where to get more browns in the future locally. And we've been getting them from a woodworker in town, and we hand out his business card. He just gives them away. So we give them the whole gamut plus some training. And they're also invited to, we're having a community compost training on the 15th. Natasha is doing it. And so all of the property managers and owners who are getting materials from us are also asked to attend a training. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so a couple things we have in the works while we're distributing pails and recycling bins are setting up some community composting sites. So the picture that Emma had of the big tumbler with a couple of seniors standing there, that was actually from one of our first community compost sites we set up a few years ago, and that was from another Berry Housing Authority property called Quarry Hill. It was a 30-unit senior housing. So community composting is a place where the people in that small community go. It's not open to the whole town. So We're setting one up on the 15th with the training, starting it off with the training from Natasha. At this site, which is called Green Acres, this is another Barre Housing Authority. The Barre Housing Authority has around, I think it's 8 or 9 properties. And you can see this is a great example of the difference in properties and how their approaches are different. The first property you saw was 11 stories in the middle of the city. This property is sprawling, it's townhouses, there's a lot of green space. They already have a community garden, and the community garden is managed by an outside organization with experts at gardening and herbs. And they're at the community garden in the communities. They have a community room 3 days a week during the growing season. So we have their support, plus these 2 folks here are going to be our compost monitors. They're dedicated gardeners, and they're really excited about having some compost to add to the soil. They already have some ideas about getting kids involved by having some of the kids go around and collect their neighbors' food scraps in 5-gallon buckets. And then they're going to be trained on the 15th when we have our big training. And we're also having all of the other property managers getting compost income. So part of our grant is paying to get them set up. Next slide. And the setup is fairly simple for the community compost sites. It's way more than you would need at a duplex or a triplex, or even a 4-unit place. But it involves, that's a large Yora tumbler. And for those of you who don't know, Yoras are pretty great quality. And they're 2-chambered, and each chamber is insulated, and they're engineered so they turn fairly easily. So that large is actually can accept around 10 families worth of food scraps. And then when both of those chambers are full, they empty into this 3-bin system. Actually, we've tweaked our design a little bit since this one was built a few years ago. We're using hemlock now, and you can't see in this photo, but the 3-bin system is fully enclosed in 1/4-inch hardware cloth. So the materials are going from one enclosed system to another. And then we include a couple of bins for holding browns, and we get them started with their browns. So this is what they'll get at the sites where they can take more material, or they have more folks. And I don't have a photo of it, but one of the managers we're working with actually has 4 properties with 4 to 6 units at each property, and we're setting her up with this system. And there's another property manager on that same street who wants to work with us. So it looks like we're going to have a system in place for a few of the unit housing sites on that street, which is a little bit closer to like the real nature of community composting. And they're going to work collaboratively, and they'll have a bunch of the tenants involved. So I didn't create a slide for this, but I wanted to end by saying, you know, we're really lucky we got this grant, and we can throw the spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. But we definitely don't know exactly what works for everybody. And we're just approaching this as we know there are challenges. We'd like to be a resource to help meet those challenges. And then our challenge is, at the end of this project, we need to glean what works and what we can bring forward for the other municipalities in our district without, you know, the big funding that we won't have that after September 30th. So with that, I don't know if there's still time for questions, or if we want to wait till the end for those.
All right, let's see, Natasha, are there any questions?
One comment, just that this is a wonderful hands-on support system. And then there was just another question about the sizing of the different drawers that I was just going to reply to in chat.
Thank you very much, Cassandra. And next we have Russell Aminzadi from Burlington. And let's see what you have to share. Thank you.
So this is going to be kind of more of a cautionary tale than a success story. It's a story of a pilot project that I put together that turned into a big project that failed mostly by being a little bit too popular. So I live in Ledgewood South. I'm on the board there. It's a homeowners association with 24 units. It's in the south end of Burlington. It's a great location. It's near the bike path. It's a short walk to the lake, short walk to the brand new food co-op, several breweries, a cidery not too far away. Our buildings are the 3 buildings you see on the bottom part here, 3 wooden buildings. and they're part of a much larger complex. And you can't see it, but off screen, there's some more condominiums as well. About half the families are owners and half of them are renters. When I heard that there was going to be mandated food scrap handling by the state of Vermont, I decided I'd put together a pilot project with a few enthusiastic people from our condo association. So I talked it up with the board members and everyone really liked the idea. Homeowners associations, I think you know, they rely on volunteer board members who do their work in their spare time. And that's a weakness. My life got very busy in early 2020 and I kept putting off organizing this pilot project. Then I noticed the deadline was approaching of July for Food Scraps 2020. I thought to myself, you know, with the way COVID's going, they're going to delay this. We'll have a few months to buy time. Well, it didn't happen. The state went ahead with it, COVID or no COVID, and we did not have the time to run this pilot and then expand it to the 24 families. So as the deadline approached, some of the other board members said, well, why don't we just see who's interested and let anyone participate? May have been a mistake. No, that's right. We were able to get a grant from the Solid Waste District. We did get a bunch of these very nice buckets and a couple of soil saver composters, 24 buckets, one for each unit. So we thought we were in good shape. So then next thing I did, and now we could go to the next slide. I scheduled an orientation. Here's the slides for my orientation. It was a Zoom-like meeting like this. I had a Q&A session with someone from Solid Waste District, an explanation of how the composting would work, a little bit about what you should and shouldn't put in the compost. And in fact, I even put together a quiz, if we go ahead one slide, on you know, what should and shouldn't go. Everybody could take a guess and we tell them, yes, hair is good. Dairy products are not in a backyard composter. So this was a small backyard composter. When I held this orientation, I expected maybe 4 families, maybe 8 families. What I didn't, and I was a little afraid no one would show. So I said, well, we've got these buckets. Let's tell them they get the bucket for free if they attend. We can get the rest out later. To my shock, 12 of our 24 families showed up, came to get their buckets, and were ready to start using this composter. So I was very impressed, but I was getting a little bit worried. And I was happy as the soil saver started getting used. And then I started to get a little concerned because it was filling up fast. So the larger association next door had already dealt with the local hauler, the same ones who do our trash hauling, Casella. And we kind of put that decision off for a while. So here's our sweet little soil saver sitting by itself. And it started to fill up a lot faster than I expected. Even worse, it was filling up with kitchen scraps without browns at all. So it wasn't composting. It was just kind of rotting and drawing flies. So we needed to get some brown matter. We needed to get it fast. We needed to catch up. And if you move to the next slide, we had another issue. The residents from this larger condominium complex, they started walking over to our bins to get rid of their scraps. And this is pretty obvious because their plan was to use the green, compostable kitchen bags. And we made it clear to the people who attended our orientation, you can't really compost those in a little backyard composter like ours. It works for the big industrial compost like Casella uses. But we kept seeing those show up, and I heard stories about people coming to our bin. If you look, our little soil saver bin was really close to some of the other units, and the bin that they had was a lot longer walk. So we were getting a lot of their stuff too. So it was a kind of crazy summer. If you flip to the next slide. So if you ever lived in a condominium or any place that has a homeowners association, you're probably familiar with this kind of thing, the passive aggressive signs that people put up. And this is my contribution, my passive aggressive sign with the yeses and the nos, and Ledgewood South residents only. Please contact me if you're going to be using it. So it was a kind of crazy summer. I don't know if you advance to the next slide. If you have seen the movie Fantasia, you know how I felt. There's a scene there where with Mickey Mouse and the Sorcerer's Apprentice, where he gets the brooms doing his work for him and gets kind of carried away and they take over. That is how I felt. I was looking for, where could I get sawdust? Where could I get brown matter? I was telling people, please put some of this sawdust in with your food scraps. I was adding more myself every time I noticed the bugs getting worse. And I rapidly, I had to throw together another bin as that one was getting awfully full. And I was kind of keeping an eye on my neighbors, waiting to catch someone in the act of using our composter. It kind of got out of hand. And as the bins got close to the top, you could flip to the next slide. We finally gave up on letting that soil saver handle all of our food waste. And as you can see, we have a bin now from the same hauler, Casella, that we are using. And we're telling people that if they would like to do the composting, they can do that. And if they just want to dump it into the bin that's being picked up, that's fine. It's actually nice for people like me because I can use the little composter for my kitchen scraps that work for the little composter, but I can put meat and dairy products and anything else that's not going to work in a soil saver. So we are managing. It's sort of turned into a hybrid system there. It is keeping our cost with the hauler down a little bit because I think we've just got, we got one bin and we would probably need two. As you can see, we really do have to do something about making it look a little prettier and get some screening around it. And that's coming up next. But right now, the waste haulers bin is going to be there for anyone who's not participating or for people who want to use it for meat and dairy scraps. And at least once these guys thaw out and I get to turn them over and see what space is in there, we'll have our composting back to some extent. And that's my story.
Great, thank you, Russell. And do we have any questions that have been coming in, Natasha?
Just a comment saying that these real stories and challenges are excellent, and thanks to all the speakers for sharing the experiences, trials, tribulations, and tips.
Excellent, agreed. And I found it interesting that Russell brought up something that Cassandra had brought up, which is a bin in hand seems to be a very powerful tactic to help get jump-start a program. Very interesting. Josh, you have your hand up.
Yeah, John, thanks. I've been chatting with Becky Atkinson in the chat, but it's just easier for me to talk. So Josh Kelly, Vermont DEC, thanks everybody for being here. And thanks for the presenters, Russell, especially for your story. We get these questions all the time. And I just point out that the struggle is if you don't put the work in that's required to manage the compost on site, then you really probably should consider paying the higher cost to have it hauled away. It's like if you go out to eat, you're not going to have to do the dishes, but you get to have the meal and just walk away at the end, but you pay more, right? So these are the trade-offs in our lives. And that's what on-site composting is all about, especially at the small residential scale, small or medium residential scale with these community groups. And people ask me all the time about winter. This is a great winter photo here of soil savers. You heard, if anybody was on this morning, industrial, like full-on farm scale and above composters who are complaining about too much heat. It's the exact opposite problem with home composting. And the reason is one of scale. These 3x3 cubic yard soil savers are great, but they are just not big enough to heat up in the winter. So the question is, how do you compost in the winter if you really want to do it? The Jora is helpful, but even Becky was noting her Jora froze up, which can happen because Joras are off the ground. The ground has heat in it, by the way, and that's what is part of the genius of the soil saver. It's in contact with the ground, which provides access for critters. Well, for critters we don't want, but I'm thinking the critters we do want, like worms, bacteria, fungi, bugs, soil microbes. And they also, because of that ground contact, they're not, I won't say they don't freeze, they do freeze, but they freeze a little less solid than some of the tumblers. But a Jora needs attention too. Even though it has that insulation, it needs that carbon added to it. It may even need, some people ask me, should I use compost starter? There's these little powders you can get, which are full of microbes. You may even want to have some of that on hand if you're trying to compost in the winter with a Jora and you're having trouble with freezing. I don't usually recommend compost powder because soil microbes are available under our feet all the time, that you really don't need it. But in the winter, things can be challenging. So my home compost recipe, and Cassandra and I have talked about this multiple times, is to have an empty soil saver at the beginning of the winter season. Basically Halloween, I empty my composter. I fill it about a third full with leaves, with a special layer of sticks or dead flower stems at the bottom to create aeration and porosity. And then I fill about a third full of dry leaves. And I store leaves in a bag or a bin or in my shed for use year round, adding to the compost bin. And then my food scraps begin to freeze solid, and they really don't start thawing out again until March. So approximately, April Fool's Day and Halloween, or you could say in some cases Easter, are the times of year you want to be thinking about what to do with your compost. But a soil saver can be good to use in conjunction with a tumbler, using the soil saver in the winter and having it be mostly empty at the beginning of a season for one family's use. One per soil saver would be ideal because it's going to fill up and freeze, and then use the tumbler in the summer and stop using the soil saver and add your browns around Easter or around April Fool's Day. So that's a lot of detail, but that's my method and it has worked for me. Everybody's got their own things. I'll turn it back over to John. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. That was brought up a lot of good points there. I've even heard some people say with the soil saver types or the earth machine types, just fill them right up with leaves to begin with, and then add your food waste in, and that can often also deter odors. So that's good in bear country and things like that. Emma, a comment.
I have a question for Cassandra.
Okay.
Do you have any initial thoughts on how you might be able to transfer this to some of your other municipalities, or is that coming next?
It's coming next.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a few broad strokes that we're getting the idea of. It seems like, the 2 to 4 unit places really, for the most part, with the right property manager or landlord, are totally appropriate for on-site composting. And the mid-size, without a super motivated property manager, are more appropriate for hauling, even though that is an added expense for the property manager. But yeah, what Josh just said is so true. And what Russell pointed out, it's like the amount of intensive energy and time and money that goes into setting up a community compost site. This site right here in this photo is one of the sites we set up. I think that's Corey Hill. That looks like Ron, who was our superhero 80-year-old compost manager. And, if it just took so much upfront overhead that it might not be something that I would recommend to most sites. But so I'm starting to sort of get some broad strokes, but I don't have anything. That's why I said that's my challenge. But I actually do have one of the final pieces of the grant is a commitment to present lessons learned to the statewide community. So I'm hoping to bring that out like at a recycling coordinators meeting or something like that in the fall. And it might be more questions for everybody, and maybe there will be a little bit that we could share that might be helpful as well.
Great. Do we have any more questions or comments?
We have one that says, I think this is directed at Russell. I'm so sorry you didn't have the kind of support you needed determining probable volumes of food scraps, number of bins needed, feedstocks and recipes to match your bin system, backyard compost training, and more. Cassandra's program offered a model for community support scaled to every particular multi-housing situation. And I think just to highlight something that Russell and I talked about, I think it was also the idea of starting with a much smaller pilot, and then without adjusting the system, jumping to full scale participation. And was probably a combination of timing and just the way, you just sometimes you have to jump in and learn your lessons. But yeah.
All right. Well, we have some more time, so I can continue on and speak to what's happening down in Brattleboro. All right. So I've kind of two topics to cover. One is our Brattleboro curbside program, which is done through the town of Brattleboro, and also one multi-unit housing location called Morningside Commons. The Brattleboro curbside program has been in business for years now and is very successful. We kind of are lucky down here in Windham County and in Brattleboro in particular to have the situation that works well. We have the town of Brattleboro, which has a relatively dense population, and we have two accessible local composting commercial scale sites, one here at Windham Solid Waste District and one in nearby in Greenfield, Massachusetts, called Martin's Farm. And the town of Brattleboro contracts out curbside collection of waste and recycling already, and they could tack on this collection of food waste. And they use small green bins with good solid latching lids, and recycling goes out with compost every week and gets picked up and brought to our composting facility. And it's very flexible in that a lot of different materials can be put into it because of our composting system. You can put soiled paper, and you can put meat and bones and all sorts of things in with that, as long as they fit in that little bin. And because of that, by weight, the town of Brattleboro curbside program has a 68% diversion rate. So that's a wonderful system that works very well. And we have active residents who are engaged and very positive about the program. So, and there's Zerbina the dog. So that's Brattleboro. And then within Brattleboro, there's a condo association called Morningside Commons, and they have 166 units. So they're a pretty big location. And because of that, they have different phases around their facility site. With several condos, a few dozen condos putting their waste at each phase location. Most of them are owner occupied, which really helps. And one is renter though. And they had major squirrel problems when they started diverting food scraps. And they are close to some open forests, so they're worried about bears as well. So they decided to contact the district and their hauler, who is Good Enough Rubbish Removal. And working together, they put together this great system where they've got the trash in a regular trash container and the recycling in the 64-gallon carts. And they have this very robust rear-loading 2-yard compost dumpster with heavy lids on the top. And these have been working great for them. They have them at each phase around their facility, and people can drop the food waste right in there. And it seems to be working and deterring the squirrels, and they haven't had bears show up. But you can see how strong that container is in the photograph. Here's the container up close. And while it's being dumped into the back of a rear packer, they have a route. Good Enough Rubbish Removal has a route where they also get other commercial waste, food scraps, and soiled paper around town. So You can see the bin is very full of food waste, and we can take the bio bags at our composting sites. So it's a system that has been working well. And I guess that is it for Brattleboro. And so I can open it up to questions. Or Natasha, how are we doing?
Yeah, no, we're good. We have still some more time for questions and discussion. And there was a question that came in for Emma asking if she could please address any enforcement measures to take place at MFC, particularly with landlords' properties or property management.
And Athena, can you clarify what MFC is?
I think that's multifamily.
Multifamily complex.
Sorry.
Thank you. Sure. Yes. So Vermont Department of Health is in charge of the rental housing health code. And so we have partnered with them a lot but they might not have the food scrap expertise or capacity. So we've partnered with them a lot to get the town health officers who actually enforce the code up to speed, and to make sure the town health officers know that they can send anybody to us or to the SWMAs, to solid waste management entities, for assistance and guidance. So if we get a complaint or concern, we are happy to get in touch with the landlords and explain the obligations, talk them through their different options, get them connected to whoever they need, sort of similar like Cassandra was talking about, sending people to this website that they've curated to answer all these questions for their region. But it's really the town health officers who would have that enforcement capacity. So we also, connect people to their town health officers as well.
Great, thank you. John, there was a question for you as to the brand of the secure food scrap toters or totes.
I'm afraid I don't know the brand. They look like Toter brand to me, but I don't know. The district does not provide those. It's through the town of Brattleboro, and I could get that and to send it out. I'm not sure exactly what sort of follow-up we're going to have, Natasha, but
if you get it to me, I can also post it, or we can include something we will be posting recordings of the sessions. It'll take me a week or two to get everything cleaned up and up on the CAV website, but we'll be posting the recording as well as a PDF of the slide deck, and we can maybe include it in that same place, some of the information, so we can wrap back around. I did want to just pick up on a thread that Cassandra brought up in terms of zoning and zoning issues that she ran into. And that is something that's really tricky because, right, it varies, like every town to town, it varies, it changes, it's hard to keep track of. We do have a session coming up on Thursday afternoon at 3 from the U.S. Composting Council, specifically about zoning. They've been trying to create like a toolkit and some draft language and ways to interact with zoning folks on composting. And community composting is specifically one of the topics that they'll be focusing on. And so I just wanted to let folks know that if there are other people out there. And yeah, it sounds that the other comment, and I'm just going to kind of keep chatting or asking my own questions, but if anyone else has questions, continue typing them in. We have a few minutes left here. Or raise your hand like a few people have if you want to just talk, that's fine too. One of the things that strikes me, Cassandra, is that you're able to provide, you have this great source for carbons. That's one thing that we've heard about. And I think that a lot of groups struggle with getting enough carbons for their system. One of the things that we do recommend for the Jora compost tumblers, if those are being used, is that a really high carbon material like a wood shaving or something be used over shredded leaves, because then you're maximizing the volume that you have, that you can so you need actually less of that carbon material to get the right C to N ratio in those systems. But But one of the things that I do in my own system is if I know that I have compostable products that I've used at a family gathering, or when I used to have board meetings in person at my board meetings, I would bring it all home and I'd run over it with my lawnmower and the compostable paper products. And I would know, because I've supplied them, I'd know that they didn't have plastic coating. I knew that it was fine. And then I'd rake it up, and that's actually really great carbon as well. There's no, that breaks down just fine in a like a community scale or backyard system. I just have a backyard system for my household now. And so I just, I think you can get creative with browns, and I actually used it right in my Jora. I wouldn't recommend like the stacks of stuff. You really, surface size matters, especially for smaller volumes. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there, in part because I know Toby from Eco Products is listening in, and he and I have talked about that as well. And, these products, as long as you know what they are, it's a really good alternative for home use, especially for home composters. They can go right into your system, really, whatever the system is. Yeah. Go ahead, Cassandra.
I have a question for Russell.
Mm-hmm.
Russell, do you think if you had a committee of 3 or so people, or would you, I guess maybe not instead of woulda, shoulda, coulda, is that something you've considered of setting up a committee and maybe expanding on your system and spreading the work around to the folks who are using it?
Yes, that was clearly, that was big part of it, was that it was all on my shoulders. I did reach out to people. This is a common thing with homeowners associations. People will, kind of try not to put too much time into it. We're all part-time. I did have 1 or 2 people. I had a lot of people who wanted to give me advice, but not a lot of people who wanted to actively participate, do the work, do the communication, and maybe get in there with a fork and do some turning and maybe find some of the browns. That's kind of what we needed. Yeah, but it's certainly something I wish we could get going in our group. Part of it is the fact that we have a lot of renters, so we do get some coming and going, and less likely. And then a lot of our owners are quite elderly, and they're all old enough that they may not be as active as we need them to be, or even as ready to participate.
Great. Any other questions? Oh, here's the 2 cubic yard rear loading dumpsters were purchased from West Equip. So there you go. That's the answer to the
Waste Quip. Yeah, I think they're out of New York.
Waste Quip.
Yeah, those were the big heavy duty 2-yard dumpsters. And if anyone has questions about how to get a hold of Waste Quip, then they can message me as well.
Great.
I actually have a question. I have a question for Natasha.
Yeah.
Let's see, we're talking about paper plates and such. We actively discourage people from using cardboard boxes, even cut up cardboard boxes, because we're afraid we'd be getting tape. Sorry, Siri thinks I'm talking to her. We were afraid we'd get tape and we get all kinds of the wrong kind of cardboard and stuff like that. But it seems to me that corrugated cardboard of the right kind, chopped up enough, is pretty darn good as a brown material. Am I right or wrong on that?
Yeah, no, that would be totally fine. But again, just like you said, you want to make sure that the tape is off, that there aren't any, some cardboard boxes have, like that there's not other plastic packaging still in it or anything. So if it's just clean cardboard, I think that would be fine. But again, you need to figure out how to shred it. I've never run over that I can remember anyway, a cardboard box with my lawnmower, but set to like the 4-inch, let me tell you, for paper cups, they pop loud. It's kind of fun, but you just run them right over and it just shreds. And then you can use like a bag to catch it in, or I just rake it up and put it in. And so I would think functionally for a small site, you'd want something that you could just shred it with, because I would personally find it pretty tedious to be trying to shred corrugated cardboard by hand.
I just, found myself scrambling for browns and then seeing all those Amazon boxes in the blue bins and thinking, oh, we want those.
Yeah. And you do also need to just watch that, some of those especially have, have things that like packaging that are actually affixed to the inside of the box. So just again, I'd recommend that you exercise a little bit of care, but does anyone else have a different opinion or thoughts about how to manage cardboard?
Well, this is Josh. I'm just going to say that most people are confused about pizza boxes. And as a society, as a professionals, we have confused the heck out of people with what to do with pizza boxes. So I don't know if I can speak for every single recycler in the state, but I do know the end markets have said that if a pizza box doesn't have a piece of pizza stuck to it, it can be recycled as long as the pizza is gone. So that means the grease is okay. And I have argument. This is where recyclers have arguments with each other, which is perfectly fine. But in general, recycling your cardboard is probably the best thing to do. But Russell probably gets questions about 100 different other paper products. Can I put my napkins in? What about paper towels? What about this clamshell I'm getting? Because every time I go to takeout, I get 60 of these. It kind of never ends. So sometimes it's easier just to say if it's food, it goes in. If it's not, it doesn't. That way you keep out some of the other stuff, the plastic bags and wrappers that sometimes migrate in. To one thing John Fay said about soil savers, I just want to mention, he's talking about filling them up with leaves, which decreases odors. I have found that in my personal experience, my soil saver works better when it's more full. The danger is the more full it is, the more likely I'm going to use up my space, especially in the wintertime. But the more full it is, it has that mass, which is what compost bacteria thrive on, critical mass to eat stuff. And it's very different from industrial composting because you keep adding to it and you have finished compost at the bottom. So it's not like a pile you've set up perfectly each time. Homeowners are producing food waste every day. So it's a very different thing than what the other composters do, the professionals do, to be fair. Yeah. Thanks, Tasha.
Yep.
Thanks, John.
Nope, sorry, John. Nope. All right, well, we are just about at 4:30 here, so I think I'm just going to bring this to a close. I'd like to thank Eco Products as our featured sponsor for this session, all of the presenters for their great information that they shared and stories and issues. And I just think it's so helpful that we can now start sharing these very real life stories and learning from them. So that's great. Thank you to all of the participants for taking a little bit of time out of your afternoon to join us. Tomorrow we will be starting at 10 a.m. again with the Connecting Farms to Communities to Close the Nutrient Loop session. So that's sort of a community-based farm composting session, which should be really interesting. And just a quick reminder that at the end of the week, everybody will receive an email with a link to an online evaluation. So if you could just take a couple minutes to fill that out at the end of the week, that would be awesome. And thank you again.